Growing up in Portland, Maine, I always believed that life could be simple if you worked hard and stayed honest. The salty breeze of the ocean, the quiet hum of fishing boats, and the rhythm of small-town life created a cocoon of safety I once thought unbreakable. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was mine. Elena, my wife, was the centerpiece of that life. Together, we built what I thought was a sturdy foundation, a home, a family, and a future. Or so I believed. Elena was stunning, not just because of her looks, though her sharp green eyes and auburn hair could light up a room, but because of her drive. She was the kind of woman who walked into a bank, took command of the room, and made you believe in her plans. That was who I fell in love with. Over time, though, that spark between us dimmed, like a ship losing its beacon in the fog. I told myself it was the strain of our jobs or raising our daughter, Audrey. But deep down, something felt off. Our 8-year-old daughter, Audrey, was our pride and joy. Her laughter was like sunshine breaking through clouds on a stormy day. She had Elena's confidence and my knack for asking too many questions. She adored spending weekends at my father's old auto shop, now my second home, tinkering with bolts and asking if she could fix the world. Audrey, as much as I loved her, was also one of the few reasons I stayed, because I couldn't bear the thought of breaking her world. Elena had changed. Subtle things at first, canceling family dinners, vague excuses about work running late, and the ever-present phone she kept close like a lifeline. Her texts were always too important to ignore, her work trips suddenly more frequent. I caught myself second-guessing the woman I'd once trusted with everything. Was it all in my head, or was the unease gnawing at my chest trying to warn me of something bigger? On Saturday morning, as sunlight poured into the kitchen, I found Elena sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone, as though nothing in the world could touch her. "You're working late again tonight?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but the tremor in my voice betrayed me. She looked up, her expression tight. "Yes, there's an audit coming up, Grant. I've told you that already." Her voice was clipped, like the conversation was an interruption rather than a moment between husband and wife. I forced a smile and nodded, but my chest tightened. It was becoming harder to ignore the distance, the wall she had built between us. That evening, while she dressed for another work dinner, I lingered in the garage, running my hands over old tools that had seen better days. The smell of oil and metal grounded me, reminded me of simpler times before life got so complicated. That night, as Audrey slept and Elena still wasn't home, I sat in silence on the back porch, the waves in the distance crashing like echoes of a life that felt farther away. Something wasn't right. I didn't know what it was yet, but the storm was coming, and I wasn't ready for how hard it would hit. It started with the little things, the kind of details you don't notice at first, but when pieced together, tell a story you don't want to believe. Elena's world seemed to orbit farther from mine with every passing day. Her laugh didn't echo through the house as often. The way she said "I love you" felt more like a habit than a sentiment, and the way she avoided my eyes, it was like she was hiding in plain sight. Audrey and I had our usual Saturday routine, pancakes on the griddle, a quick trip to the shop, and then an afternoon at the park. Elena used to join us, before work consumed her weekends. Now it was just me and our daughter, with her tiny hands clinging to mine as we walked beneath the golden autumn leaves. "Daddy," Audrey asked, her voice tinged with the curiosity only a child could have, "why doesn't Mommy come to the park with us anymore?" I froze for a moment, the question cutting deeper than it should have. "Mommy's really busy, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile. "She's working hard for us." Audrey nodded, her innocent acceptance of my half-truth stinging more than I expected. She didn't press further, but her question stayed with me, circling like a storm cloud in my mind. That night, Elena came home late again. Her excuse was polished, practiced. "There was a last-minute client meeting," she said, slipping off her heels and avoiding my gaze. She moved quickly, as if staying still too long would expose her. I wanted to ask her where she'd really been, but my chest tightened. What if I didn't want the answer? "Everything okay at work?" I asked, my voice cautious. "Of course," she replied, her tone clipped. "It's just busy, Grant. You know how it is." I didn't press further. But as she disappeared into the bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her, piece by piece, like sand slipping through my fingers. The next morning, a small detail tipped the scales. Elena's phone buzzed as she showered, the screen lighting up on the kitchen counter. A name I didn't recognize flashed across it, Dominic Westbrook. The text preview read, "Can't wait to see you again." I stared at the phone, my stomach sinking. It felt like I was intruding on something sacred even though this was my wife. The urge to grab it and read more gnawed at me, but I stepped back, letting it buzz unanswered. When she emerged from the bathroom, hair damp and dressed for another long day, I asked as casually as I could, "Who's Dominic?" She froze. It was subtle, but I saw it, the flicker of panic in her eyes before she covered it with a smile. "Just a client," she said too quickly. "Nothing to worry about." Her answer didn't ease the knot in my chest. If anything, it tightened. I watched her leave, her perfume lingering in the air like a ghost of something I once trusted. As the door clicked shut, the silence in the house was deafening. That night I confided in Roland and Calvin. Over beers in my dimly lit garage, I laid it all out. The distance, the late nights, the text. "Am I crazy?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of my uncertainty. Roland shook his head, his expression grim. "You're not crazy, Grant, but you might not like what you find." His words lingered as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. I could feel Elena beside me, her breaths steady, her body just inches away. But she felt like a stranger. Something was wrong. I didn't know what yet, but I could feel it, like the distant rumble of a storm on the horizon. Sunday evening, the air was heavy with an uneasy quiet as Elena sat across from me at the dinner table. Audrey had already gone to bed, her soft giggles from earlier replaced by the hum of the refrigerator. Elena's gaze was glued to her phone, her fork idly pushing food around her plate. She hadn't touched her glass of wine. A rare sight. "Elena," I began, my voice firmer than I intended. She glanced up, startled, her eyes meeting mine briefly before darting away. "Yes?" she asked, her tone guarded. "Who is Dominic?" The question hung between us, a fragile thing that could shatter with the wrong response. Her shoulders tensed. For a moment, the room was so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. "I told you," she said finally, her voice tight. "He's a client." I nodded, leaning back in my chair. "And does every client text you that they can't wait to see you again? Seems personal." Her fork clattered onto the plate, the sound sharp enough to make me flinch. "You went through my phone?" she accused, her tone laced with anger. "No," I said calmly, though my heart was racing. "Your phone buzzed while you were in the shower. I saw the name." She crossed her arms, her defensive posture like a barrier between us. "Grant, you're overreacting. It was just a message. Dominic is persistent, but it's harmless." "Harmless?" My voice rose despite my attempt to stay composed. "You've been distant for months, Elena. Late nights, canceled plans, cryptic excuses. And now this?" I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. "I feel like I don't even know you anymore." Her eyes flickered with something, guilt maybe, or defiance. "You're being paranoid," she snapped. "Just because I'm busy doesn't mean I'm doing anything wrong." I stood up, unable to sit still as frustration churned inside me. "This isn't just about being busy. It's about trust, Elena, and right now, I don't know if I can trust you." She stood too, her voice rising to match mine. "You're the one accusing me without proof. You're the one creating problems where there are none." "Then prove me wrong!" I shouted, my fists clenched at my sides. "Show me that I'm wrong about Dominic, about everything." Her silence was deafening. She stared at me, her expression unreadable before shaking her head. "I don't have to explain myself to you, Grant. I've done nothing wrong." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But the cracks in her story were too glaring to ignore. "You know what?" I said, my voice dropping to a cold, quiet tone. "Maybe it's time we stop pretending that this is fine, that we're fine." She opened her mouth as if to argue, but no words came. Instead, she grabbed her phone from the table and walked away, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the kitchen. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty chair she left behind. The woman I married, the woman I thought I knew, was slipping away from me, and no amount of shouting would bring her back. Later that night, as I lay awake in the dark, I made a decision. If Elena wouldn't give me answers, I'd find them myself. The following morning, the tension from the previous night lingered like a thick fog. Elena had left for work early, her goodbye a clipped murmur as she grabbed her coat and stepped out. The house felt hollow without her presence, but it wasn't the absence of her voice that gnawed at me. It was the silence where truth should have been. I sat in the living room, the sunlight streaming through the blinds, casting faint patterns on the floor. My gaze fell on the table where Elena had left her laptop, carelessly open but locked. It was unlike her. She guarded her devices like secrets wrapped in steel. But this morning, she had left a crack in the armor. I stared at it for what felt like hours, debating whether I had the right. But the truth was, the Elena I once knew wouldn't have made me question her. The Elena I trusted wouldn't leave me doubting every word she said. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I tried her usual passwords. Birthdays, our anniversary, even Audrey's name. Nothing worked. Then I remembered something. The small, sticky note she used to keep in her planner for emergencies. I rifled through her desk drawer until I found it, tucked between receipts and old envelopes. The screen unlocked with a faint click, and what stared back at me sent a chill racing down my spine. Emails. Dozens of them. All from Dominic Westbrook. The subject lines alone were enough to make my stomach turn. Last night was amazing. I can't wait to see you again. Our next getaway. I clicked on one at random, my hands trembling. The words on the screen blurred as anger and disbelief flooded my vision. They weren't just professional exchanges. They weren't even casual. They were intimate, detailed, and undeniable. I loved how you laughed last night. It felt like we were the only two people in the world. Let's make it a weekend to remember. You deserve so much more than what you have now. My breath hitched, the words slicing through me like jagged glass. Deserve more? More than me? My chest tightened, my thoughts spiraling into a storm of rage and heartbreak. I scrolled further, my fingers moving as if on autopilot. Hotel bookings, dinner reservations, photos of them together, her smiling in ways I hadn't seen in years, her hand resting on his arm as though he were the one she trusted, the one she loved. The betrayal was tangible, a weight pressing against my ribs until I thought I might shatter under its force. It wasn't just about the emails or the photos. It was the realization that the woman I had built my life around had been tearing it apart piece by piece, right under my nose. I slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing through the empty house. My breathing was shallow, my hands shaking as I ran them through my hair. Every moment with her now felt like a lie. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered promise. By the time she came home that evening, I was waiting for her in the living room, the laptop sitting on the table like evidence in a courtroom. She walked in, her smile faltering when she saw me. "Grant?" she asked, her voice uncertain. I didn't say anything at first, just gestured to the laptop. "Explain this." Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face before she tried to cover it with feigned confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Elena," I said, my voice breaking. "Don't lie to me, not anymore." Her silence spoke louder than any excuse could have, and in that moment I knew there was no going back. The ocean breeze whipped against my face as Calvin, Roland, and I pushed the small boat further from the shore. It was supposed to be a weekend of escape, a time to clear my mind from the mess that was my marriage. No texts, no emails, no Elena. Just the sea, a fishing rod, and a cooler full of beer. For a brief moment I felt lighter, as if the weight of betrayal had been left on the dock behind me. Hours passed in quiet camaraderie. The rhythmic splashes of our lines hitting the water, Calvin's bad jokes, and Roland's grumbling about a tangled reel all created a soundtrack of normalcy I hadn't felt in months. We anchored near a rocky outcrop, watching the sun dip into the horizon. The world felt distant, almost peaceful. Then my world cracked open. I didn't hear the phone call, but I'd later learn how it unfolded. Elena was at her office when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was cold, mechanical. "Mrs. Calderon," it began, "your husband has been taken. We demand $250,000 in cash within 24 hours, or you'll never see him again." "What?" Elena's voice reportedly trembled, though I couldn't imagine her fear was solely for me. Who is this? What do you mean taken?" "Don't call the police," the voice continued. "We'll provide further instructions soon. If you involve anyone, he dies." The line went dead. She must have been paralyzed for a moment, gripping her desk phone like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. Elena was nothing if not calculated, though. She knew calling the police was a risk, but a necessary one. The call came through dispatch just as Roland and I were untangling another one of his lines. The Coast Guard approached our boat at full throttle, their stern expressions signaling trouble. "Which one of you is Grant Calderon?" one of them barked, their weapons pointed directly at me. I raised my hands, confused and slightly annoyed. "I'm Grant. What the hell is this about?" "We received a report of a ransom situation involving you. We need to verify your safety immediately." Calvin snorted. "Ransom? What kind of idiot kidnaps someone on a fishing trip?" I glanced at Roland, who shared my bafflement. "Well, as you can see, I'm perfectly fine. You mind lowering those guns?" Their search was thorough, even invasive, as they combed through the boat. After confirming my identity, their leader apologized, but insisted I come with them for questioning. My friends were left behind, their laughter and confusion fading as the Coast Guard ferried me back to shore. Back at the station, the pieces of the story began to fit, but in all the wrong ways. The ransom call wasn't about me, it was about Derek. The kidnappers had taken my brother, mistaking him for me. And somehow, Elena was at the center of it all. The realization hit me like a wave. Her secrets, her lies, they weren't just about an affair. They'd entangled me in something far darker than I could have imagined. The living room was thick with tension. Elena sat on the couch, her legs crossed tightly, a mug of untouched tea cradled in her hands. Across from her, Detective Abel flipped through his notebook, his pen tapping softly against the paper. I stood by the window, arms crossed, staring out at the driveway. The late evening cast long shadows across the room, but none were darker than the ones settling over our marriage. "So, let me get this straight," Abel began, his voice even but laced with skepticism. "The kidnappers called you thinking they had Grant, but they actually took his brother, Derek?" "Yes," Elena replied, her tone clipped. "They realized their mistake and doubled the ransom. $300,000 instead of $250,000. They said it was compensation for the trouble." I turned sharply. "Trouble? Are you hearing yourself, Elena? My brother is being held by criminals because of—" I stopped myself, my voice catching. "Because of what?" She shot back, her eyes narrowing. I wanted to scream. "Because of your lies, because of Dominic, because you've tangled us in a web I don't understand." But I didn't. Instead, I looked at Abel, hoping he would step in and end the war brewing in my chest. "Mrs. Calderon," Abel said, his voice calm but firm, "we need you to walk us through every detail of that call. Leave nothing out. What exactly did they say? Did they give any clues about their location or identities?" Elena hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "They said they knew Grant was worth a lot on paper, that the ransom was just a fraction of what he could afford. They mentioned following me earlier in the day, watching where I went." Her voice faltered. "They knew I was at the office, but they also mentioned the hotel." The words hung in the air like poison. My stomach churned as I pieced it together. The hotel, Dominic, Derek. "You told them I was at the hotel, didn't you?" My voice was low, but the accusation in it was unmistakable. "I didn't—" she started, then stopped, her hands trembling around the mug. "I don't know how they knew, Grant. I swear." But her words rang hollow. I saw it in her eyes, the cracks in her story, the guilt she tried to bury beneath the surface. Abel cleared his throat. "This hotel, is it significant to either of you? Somewhere you frequent? A meeting place, perhaps?" My laugh was bitter, cutting through the silence. "It's significant to her, apparently." "Grant!" Elena snapped, but the truth was already spilling out. "Dominic Westbrook," I said, the name tasting like bile. "He's not just a client, is he, Elena? He's your lover." She froze, her face pale as if I'd slapped her. This isn't the time to discuss." "It's exactly the time!" I roared. "You dragged me into this mess with your lies, your cheating, and now Derek's paying the price for it." Abel raised a hand, his calm demeanor faltering for the first time. "Mr. Calderon, I need you to focus. We can address personal matters later. Right now, we have to figure out how to locate your brother." I turned away, my chest heaving. The room spun, and the weight of betrayal pressed against my ribs like a vice. "He didn't deserve this," I muttered. "None of us did." But deep down, I knew the worst was yet to come. The safe house where Derek was being held was a decayed relic of the past, an abandoned office building at the edge of the city, surrounded by chain-link fences and overgrown weeds. It had rained earlier, leaving the asphalt slick and glistening under the dim streetlights. Detective Abel's team moved in silently, their radios crackling faintly with updates as they prepared to breach the building. I stayed behind, pacing in the makeshift command center, my stomach churning with a volatile mix of anger, guilt, and fear. Elena stood across the room, arms crossed tightly, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't said much since the last call from the kidnappers, but I could see the storm of emotions brewing behind her guarded expression. "How did it come to this?" I muttered to no one in particular, my voice barely above a whisper. Elena glanced at me but said nothing. For the first time in years, she looked like a stranger, a woman I could no longer recognize, let alone trust. The radio buzzed and Abel's voice came through, calm but firm. "We're going in. Stay on standby." The next few minutes stretched into an eternity. I clenched my fists, every second dragging like an anchor through my chest. Then the radio crackled again. "We've got him," Abel reported. "He's alive." I exhaled sharply, the tension in my body releasing all at once, but relief was fleeting, quickly replaced by the burning questions I'd been suppressing. How much had Derek known? How deep was he in this tangled web of deceit? The door to the command center swung open and Abel walked in, his face grim. Behind him, 2 officers escorted Derek. My brother looked disheveled, his clothes torn, his face bruised, and his wrists still red from the bindings. But what struck me most was his expression. Not relief, not fear, but shame. "Grant," he started, his voice hoarse. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I stepped closer, my hands trembling. "Didn't mean for what, Derek? To get caught? To ruin everything?" Elena shifted uneasily in the corner, her eyes darting between us. Abel cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "We need to debrief him. There's a lot we still don't know." I turned to Derek, my anger boiling over. "What I know is that you've been lying to me, to everyone for years, and now your lies have put us all in danger." Derek's shoulders slumped, his voice barely audible. "I didn't ask to be taken, Grant. They thought I was you. They wanted you." "Then why?" I said, my voice rising. "Did they know about the hotel? About her?" Elena flinched at the accusation, but I didn't care. The walls of pretense were crumbling around us, and there was no stopping the collapse. Derek hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know how they found out, I swear, but I didn't stop it, Grant. I didn't stop any of it because I thought she would leave you, and I thought I could—" "Enough!" My voice cracked, raw with emotion. "You don't get to justify this, not after everything." Abel stepped in, his tone firm. "That's enough for now. We'll continue this back at the station." As they led Derek away, I felt the weight of betrayal settle heavily on my shoulders. Elena tried to approach me, her voice soft and pleading. "Grant, please, let me explain." But I couldn't look at her. I couldn't hear the excuses or the lies, not anymore. Turning away, I walked out into the cold night, leaving her words behind me. The drive home was silent except for the soft hum of the tires on wet asphalt. Each mile stretched longer than the last, as if the road itself were mocking my attempts to escape the chaos of the night. Derek's face lingered in my mind, his bruised features, his broken words. The brother I once trusted had become a stranger, tangled in secrets I hadn't dared imagine. But it wasn't just him. It was Elena, too. Her voice, pleading and desperate, echoed in my head. "Grant, let me explain." "Explain what? That the woman I loved had betrayed me in ways I wasn't sure I could forgive?" When I pulled into the driveway, the house loomed dark and quiet. its windows like unblinking eyes watching my every move. Audrey was with my parents for the night, a decision I'd made hastily earlier in the day, knowing she deserved to be far from this mess. But the silence that greeted me felt heavier without her small voice filling the space. Inside, the air was thick, stagnant, as if it had been holding its breath. I dropped my keys on the counter and headed to the garage. It was the one place that still felt mine, untouched by lies or betrayal. The faint scent of motor oil and sawdust clung to the air, grounding me in a way I desperately needed. I sat on the old stool by the workbench, my hands running over the faded wood. This was where it all began, where my father had taught me to fix things. Broken engines, dented fenders, rusted tools. "Anything can be repaired," he used to say, his calloused hands working tirelessly, "if you care enough to try." But some things couldn't be fixed. Not engines, not relationships. My thoughts drifted back to Derek, to the cracks in our bond that had started long before tonight. As kids, we'd been inseparable. He was the smooth talker, the charmer, while I was the steady hand. Together, we balanced each other, a perfect team, or so I thought. I remembered the first betrayal. I was 17, head over heels for a girl named Hannah. She was sweet, with a laugh that could light up a room. But then Derek happened. A few sly words, a stolen moment, and she was his. He didn't apologize. He didn't even seem to notice the hurt he'd caused. "She wasn't worth it," he'd said, as if that could erase the sting. It didn't stop there. Girlfriends, friends, even opportunities I'd worked for. He always found a way to take what wasn't his, and each time I forgave him, because that's what family does, right? We forgive. We move on. But this was different. He hadn't just taken something from me. He'd put my family in danger. He'd shattered the fragile trust I'd clung to for years. A knock at the door broke my reverie. I hesitated, my heart pounding, before pulling it open. Elena stood there, her face pale, her eyes rimmed red. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her own choices. "Grant," she whispered, stepping inside. I need to tell you everything." Her voice trembled, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Then start talking," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "But know this, if you lie, even once, we're done." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she began, her voice breaking. "Dominic, it was a mistake, but Derek, he made it worse." As her words spilled out, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Every lie, every omission, every betrayal. It all led back to one undeniable truth. The people I trusted most were the ones who had broken me. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of salt from the nearby ocean. I stood on the porch of the house that had once felt like a fortress, gazing at the moving truck parked in the driveway. Inside, boxes were being loaded, each one filled with fragments of a life I was leaving behind. Elena's confession had unraveled everything. The tangled mess of lies, the betrayal that ran deeper than I'd imagined. It was all too much to bear. I had tried, in those final conversations, to understand her reasoning, but every word she spoke felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. "I never meant to hurt you," she had said, her voice thick with regret. "It just happened." But betrayal doesn't just happen. It's a series of choices, each one carving away at trust until there's nothing left. I had listened, nodded, even promised to remain civil for Audrey's sake. But the truth was, my forgiveness, if it ever came, would have to come from a distance. Audrey tugged at my sleeve, her wide eyes searching mine. "Daddy, why are we moving?" I crouched down, brushing a strand of her golden hair from her face. "Because sometimes," I said carefully, "when things break, it's better to start fresh." Her brow furrowed as she tried to process my words, but she nodded, trusting me in the way only a child could. "Will we still be happy?" "Yes," I said firmly, pulling her into a hug. "We will." The decision to sell the house and move had come quickly. Staying in Portland, surrounded by memories that felt like ghosts, wasn't an option. I had found a modest home in a quieter part of town, closer to the edge of the water. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. a place to rebuild, to heal. As the last of the boxes were loaded, I turned to Calvin and Roland, who had been helping me all morning. They had been my anchors through the storm, their steady presence reminding me that not all relationships were fragile. "You sure about this?" Calvin asked, his tone more serious than usual. "Yeah," I said, exhaling deeply. "It's time." That evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, I sat on the new porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. Audrey played in the yard, her laughter mingling with the sound of the waves. For the first time in months, I felt a sliver of peace, a fragile thing, but real. I thought about Derek, about the man he had become and the brother I had lost. He was staying away for now, giving me the space I needed. Whether we would ever mend what had been broken, I didn't know. Some wounds were too deep to heal completely. And then there was Sienna. We had spoken briefly since the chaos unfolded, her voice steady despite the cracks I could hear underneath. She was navigating her own wreckage, her own betrayals. Yet, in those conversations, there was something unspoken, a quiet understanding, a shared pain that tethered us together in a way I hadn't expected. The door creaked open behind me, and Audrey padded out, her small hands clutching a sketchbook. "Look, Daddy," she said, climbing onto my lap. She flipped through pages of crayon drawings, our new house, the ocean, the two of us holding hands. "It's beautiful," I said, my throat tightening. "It's home," she replied simply. And in that moment I knew she was right. It wasn't just the house. It was the feeling, the promise of something better, a new beginning. The courtroom was cold, not from the air conditioning, but from the sterile indifference of its design. Rows of benches stretched out behind me, mostly empty except for a few curious faces who had wandered in. Across the aisle, Derek sat with his lawyer, his face a mask of forced calm, but I could see the cracks. His eyes darted nervously, his fingers tapping an erratic rhythm on the table. This wasn't a criminal trial, not yet. It was a civil matter, one Sienna and I had carefully orchestrated. After weeks of digging through financial records and piecing together the puzzle of his betrayals, we had uncovered enough to hit Derek where it would hurt most, his bank account. It wasn't about the money. It was about justice, about taking back what he had stolen, not just in dollars, but in trust. The judge entered and the murmurs faded into silence. The proceedings began, each side presenting their case. Derek's lawyer painted him as a misunderstood businessman, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control, but Sienna's attorney dismantled that facade with surgical precision. Transaction after transaction, lie after lie, they laid it all bare. Sienna sat beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her calm exterior betrayed little, but I knew her well enough now to sense the storm beneath. This wasn't just about reclaiming her finances. It was about reclaiming her dignity. When the judge finally ruled in our favor, the relief in the room was palpable. Derek was ordered to repay every cent he had siphoned from Sienna's accounts, plus damages. He would be financially ruined, but it wasn't the money that broke him. It was the humiliation. The brother who had spent his life charming and manipulating his way to success was now exposed for what he truly was. After the hearing, I found him outside the courthouse, his shoulders slumped as he lit a cigarette with shaking hands. For a moment I considered walking away, but there was still one thing I needed to say. "Derek," I called, my voice steady. He turned, his expression hardening. "What do you want, Grant? Haven't you taken enough?" I stepped closer, meeting his glare head-on. "I didn't take anything from you. You did this to yourself. All I did was shine a light on the mess you created." He scoffed, dragging on his cigarette. "You think this makes you better than me? You're just as spiteful." I shook my head. "Maybe. But the difference is, I'm not standing here with nothing. You betrayed everyone who ever cared about you, and now you're alone. That's on you." For the first time, his mask slipped. His jaw tightened, and his eyes glistened with something that looked like regret. But I wasn't sure I believed it. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving him to face the consequences of his choices. Back at home, Sienna and I sat on the porch, the weight of the day slowly lifting. Audrey played in the yard, her laughter a balm to the wounds of the past. You did the right thing, Sienna said softly, her hand brushing mine. It doesn't feel good, I admitted, but it feels necessary. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Sometimes necessary is enough. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. And for the first time in years, I felt the warmth of closure. Not the kind that fixes everything, but the kind that lets you start again. The first rays of sunlight spilled through the windows of the new house, casting golden streaks across the wooden floors. The quiet hum of the morning felt different here, lighter, less burdened by the weight of old memories. I stood in the kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in my hands, watching Audrey at the dining table as she meticulously colored in her sketchbook. "Daddy," she said, her voice breaking the silence, "can we go to the beach today? I want to find shells for the jar." "Of course," I replied, smiling. "Let's make it a tradition." She grinned, her excitement infectious. It was these moments that reminded me why I had fought so hard to rebuild, to give her a life untouched by the pain I had endured. The journey to this point hadn't been easy. The scars of betrayal still lingered, but they no longer defined me. Derek's downfall and Elena's departure had left a void, but it wasn't emptiness I feared. It was stagnation. Staying in the past, letting it consume me, wasn't an option. I had a daughter to raise, a life to live, and perhaps something new to discover. The knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. When I opened it, Sienna stood there, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, a small smile playing on her lips. She held a tray of muffins, a gesture that felt both simple and profound. "I figured you could use some breakfast," she said. "Perfect timing," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. "Audrey's been begging for muffins." As Sienna joined us at the table, the room felt fuller, warmer. Audrey talked animatedly about the shells she wanted to find, her voice weaving a thread of joy through the quiet morning. Sienna listened intently, her presence steady and calming. It was a stark contrast to the chaos that had once filled this space. Later that day, we walked along the beach, the waves lapping at our feet. Audrey ran ahead, her laughter mingling with the sound of the surf. Sienna and I strolled behind her, the distance between us growing smaller with every step. "I wasn't sure I'd ever feel normal again," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Sienna glanced at me, her expression soft. "Normal is overrated," she said. "But peace, that's worth everything." I nodded, her words resonating deeply. Peace wasn't something that came easily. It had to be earned, fought for. And in this moment, I realized we were both doing just that. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting hues of orange and pink across the water, Audrey ran back to us, her hands full of shells. She proudly showed off her treasures, her face glowing with happiness. "These are perfect," Sienna said, crouching down to admire them. "You have an eye for beauty, Audrey." "So do you," I murmured, the words slipping out before I could catch them. Sienna looked up, her cheeks flushing slightly, but she didn't look away. In her gaze, I saw something I hadn't felt in years, possibility. That night, as I tucked Audrey into bed, she clung to my hand for a moment longer than usual. "I like Sienna," she said sleepily. "She makes you smile." I kissed her forehead, my chest tightening with emotion. "She makes me feel like I can." As I sat on the porch later, the night air cool against my skin, I allowed myself to hope, for healing, for growth, for something new. Rising from the ashes wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Because what lay ahead was mine to create. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the world in warm hues of amber and gold. I stood on the edge of the dock, the water rippling softly beneath my feet, reflecting the beauty of the horizon. Audrey sat nearby with Sienna, her giggles echoing as they skipped stones across the glassy surface of the lake. This was the life I had dreamed of. Not one of perfection, but one of peace. The path to this moment had been rough, the ground uneven and filled with sharp edges. Yet here I was, standing tall, knowing I had earned every inch of this serenity. Sienna glanced up, her eyes catching mine, a gentle smile playing on her lips. It was a smile I had come to cherish, not because it erased the pain of the past, but because it promised a future worth holding on to. As the last stone plunked into the water, Audrey jumped up, running toward me. "Daddy, look how far I got that one," she exclaimed, her face glowing with pride. I bent down, pulling her into a hug. "You're a natural," I said, ruffling her hair. "One day you'll outskip us all." Her laughter was the sweetest sound, a melody that chased away the lingering shadows in my heart. As she dashed back to Sienna, the two of them shared a look, a connection that felt effortless and real. Later, we gathered on the porch, the evening settling in around us like a warm blanket. Audrey fell asleep in my lap, her tiny breaths steady and calm. Sienna sat beside me, her hand brushing mine. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a hint of hesitation. I knew what she meant without needing clarification. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not the way I used to. The pain feels distant now, like it belongs to someone else." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the stars beginning to peek through the fading light. "I think that's how it's supposed to be. The past doesn't go away, but it doesn't have to define us." I turned to her, the weight of her words sinking in. "You've taught me that," I said, my voice steady. "You've taught me that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about moving forward." Her smile widened, and she leaned her head against my shoulder. In the quiet of the night, surrounded by the people who mattered most, I felt something I hadn't in years: completeness. The next morning I woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of Audrey's laughter drifting from the kitchen. Sienna was at the stove, flipping pancakes with a grace that made it seem effortless. For a moment I just stood there, taking it all in. The sight of my daughter happy, the warmth of a woman who cared for us both, the promise of a new day. "Breakfast is almost ready," Sienna said, glancing over her shoulder. "Audrey's in charge of syrup distribution." "I hope she doesn't charge me extra," I teased, walking over and kissing Audrey on the forehead. "She might," Sienna replied, her laughter filling the room. As we sat together at the table, sunlight streaming through the windows, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. The road to this moment had been long, filled with detours and unexpected turns. But it had led me here, to love, to family, to a life rebuilt from the ashes. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back. What do you think of Grant and his journey to rebuild his life after betrayal? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And be sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen. See you in the next story.